profitability, reduce greenhouse gas emissions and enhance sustainability of livestock and crop production systems under a changing climate. Warwick has significant experience in investigating soil carbon under grazing systems, led the central New South Wales component of the SCARP program and helped develop the first pilot pricing scheme for soil carbon in Australia.
Thanks, Jeff. Sorry, just get the presentation up. Just while that's going on. Today, what I really want to talk to you about is what's coming as far as emissions reductions. So we're all aware that this is sort of a massive industry and you can see this already in the power industry, how this is affecting this quite big transition from a system that was very heavily based on fossil fuels and carbon intense to renewable energy. And this is going to be happening across all sectors of the economy, and agriculture is not immune to that. So we are roughly responsible for about 13% of Australian emissions, and we'll have to make changes to reduce emissions in agriculture. And so today I'm really going to talk about what to expect, particularly over the next few years, and what you can do now and what you might be doing in the future to address this problem. So I just sort of wanted to give you a bit of a background about where this all started. So you would have heard net zero by 2050. It's sort of now in government legislation, but it all started with the Paris COP agreement to keep global warming below 2 degrees. And so once that commitment was made and enshrined, then to do that, we had to map out what are the emission reduction strategies to do that. And so that put in place this target of net zero. So to keep under 2 degrees, we have to have our emissions or net emissions at zero by 2050. So what that means is we're still going to have emissions that we're emitting, and we can't get away from that. And agriculture is a classic example of that with something like methane. We will have methane in the future. But what we need to be by 2050 is, as an economy and globally, we need to be at net zero where we're taking out as much carbon as we're emitting into the atmosphere. So the Australian targets, as I mentioned, the federal government has set a net zero target, as have all our states. But to get to that, we have to, I guess we've got some points along the road that we need to meet. The first one's though is 2030, and we need a 43% reduction in emissions by that stage, below 2005 levels. So that sounds like a lot, but we're sort of well underway. So already Australia is about 25% below that target. So most of that has been from change in land use, so we're not clearing as much vegetation, and that transition that's occurring with renewables is also contributing. But in agriculture, our biggest problem is methane. It's a byproduct of rumen fermentation. It is something that it's a process that's naturally evolved over a very long period of time, and will be very difficult to offset those emissions in a very short period of time. And you will have heard of a lot of things about that are happening around this, particularly seaweed, Asparagopsis or red seaweed, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit later and the potential. So enteric methane is about 70% of our agricultural emissions. And one of our biggest challenges we've got is that most of our animals are grazing on sheep on pasture, so 96% of our sheep and cattle are grazing. And when you look at the technologies that are out there to reduce methane emissions, as supplements like 3-Nop or Asparagopsis, they're only very efficient when you feed them in a total mixed ration. If you supplement them in a paddock like we supplement our livestock at the moment, where they might get something at the beginning of one day or they might not get supplement for a couple of days, the efficiency of those products drops off dramatically. And so undergrazing, it's not going to be a silver bullet that actually solves this problem for you. It's going to be a whole heap of strategies that need to be put together to reduce methane. On the other side, because methane is a hard to abate gas, there's no expectation that it's going to be at zero methane by 2050. And the most realistic expectation is around the methane pledge, which says roughly about 30% reduction by 2030, and then a 47% reduction by 2050. So these are the realistic targets that we're starting to aim for. So if as a business you can demonstrate that you've reduced your emissions by about 30% by 2030, you'll be sort of well in the accepted area, I think. You don't have to be at net zero. With the greenhouse gases, this is just more of a little bit of a revision about what global warming potentials are. So we standardise this for each of the gases back to what carbon dioxide equivalent is. So carbon dioxide equivalent is 1. And we do this over a 100-year time period because there's two things. They have different global warming potentials over different time periods. And so something like methane is a really short-lived gas, so it only lives for 12 years in the atmosphere. And so when we average that global warming potential over a short period of time, it's about 27 for enteric methane. Nitrous oxide, it lasts in the atmosphere for a bit longer, 121 years, and has a global warming potential over that 100-year period of 273. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, has very long lifetime in the atmosphere. So when we're looking at what can we change to have a quicker impact, something like methane is something, if we change now, we know that 12 years down the pipe, it's actually had a positive impact on our atmosphere. Otherwise, if we're looking at carbon drawdown things, we're looking at processes where we take that carbon out of the atmosphere, which can be done with trees and soil carbon sequestration and other industrial processes, but then we've got to store that and keep storing that for long periods of time. One of the key concepts that I want you to understand today is the concept of emissions intensity, or greenhouse gas emissions intensity. So this is the amount of greenhouse gases that you produce per tonne of product that you produce. And the reason that this is really important is that this is the metric that you're likely to be assessed against in the supply chain. So in the future, you may be asked to prove what your footprint is, and your footprint is basically your greenhouse gas intensity. And the other reason I wanted to point this out is there's two sides to this equation. There is the emission side, so you can reduce your emissions on one side, but if you're reducing your productivity at the same rate, then there's no net gain in the greenhouse gas benefit of that product, because they have to source that product from elsewhere the less you produce. So we really need to start focusing on things that at least maintain productivity or build productivity in your business, but either don't increase greenhouse gas emissions or lower greenhouse gas emissions. And so we need to work on those two sides. And the reason we've looked at things that have had great greenhouse gas reduction and have been looked at this in the lab, but then when you've gone out and compared the productivity side of it, the benefits have been nowhere near as great. And this is why we really need to keep an eye on this. And that productivity side is an efficiency side that you can really start working on now in your business, and get benefits in your business from that and reduce your footprint. And so this sort of leads into this supply chain. Most of our major corporations now have set net zero targets or carbon reduction targets. And so these corporations have set these sometimes at a very high level. So they've decided, right, we need to do this because our shareholders expect us to do this. The governments that we're working in, the countries that we're working in, expect us to do this. So they've made these claims. And about Now, 90% of the top 50 companies have made net zero targets. But it's going to be this climate-related financial disclosure that's going to force these companies into taking action. So if you set a target, then this climate-related financial disclosure is the mechanism by making sure you're accountable for that target. And so one of the things that all these corporations are doing now is, first of all, trying to understand exactly what their emissions are, and then they're trying to work out ways that they can reduce those emissions in their supply chain. And as agricultural producers, you're what we call a scope 3 emissions for these large companies. So you're included on their balance sheet of emissions. And so it will be in their interest to work with you to help you reduce your emissions in the future. And this is why I think this is not all bad. You're not going to be left on your own to deal with this and doing it in isolation. The whole supply chain is going to be trying to work together to do this. As an example, I took part in a pilot by Commonwealth Bank recently to document emissions, footprints of their businesses, and that's sort of the first step of them understanding that so that they can then have an idea of what their loan book is and the emissions in actually their loan book. So this is just a description of what is actually included in a carbon footprint. The first thing, if you focus on the orange area in the centre, it's got your emissions or direct emissions from your business. So the big one that we've already talked about is methane, but you also have things like nitrous oxide from your crop emissions, so that's from the fertiliser and the residue breakdown within that. We also have CO2 from things like lime use and from energy use on your farms. So once we understand the emissions that you've got, then we then have the opportunity to offset some of those emissions with sequestration that has occurred either in trees on your farm. So if you've planted trees since 2005, the carbon that's sequestered in those trees in any one year can be offset against the emissions in that year. Soil carbon is the other big one, and often when we talk about carbon farming, everyone starts with soil carbon and then you work back through to the other things. But soil carbon is of a lot of interest, but it's very difficult to get document accurate change on a year-by-year basis because it's quite dynamic and it's quite costly to get the sampling regime to have accuracy around the issues that Jason was talking about earlier today. The other one is we also, as producers, need to report our Scope 3 emissions. So they're the emissions of the products that you're bringing onto your farm. So these are the things like the fertilisers you use, mainly nitrogen fertiliser is a big one, the ag chem that you're using on your property, and another one for livestock businesses is if you're trading livestock, the emissions that are already embedded in those animals as they come onto your farm will be counted in your Scope 3. So this is just to give you a bit of a breakdown of what our typical footprints might be for different enterprises. So while I've got rangeland beef up here, the rough proportions of this, say for a sheep production enterprise or a more productive beef enterprise, are pretty much the same. Enteric methane is well over 90%, often over 95% of those emissions. And so if you're operating those systems, then what it tells you is it's enteric methane 1, 2 and 3 should be a priority in what you're actually managing. You'll notice also here where I've got up the grains that they have a much lower footprint per tonne of product than our animal production systems, and that's just that they're naturally lower emitting than because they don't have the methane, enteric methane from the ruminant animals in there. This is just to break down those a little bit more by enterprise level. So if you can sort of try to understand sort of what different enterprises on your farm might have. So this is on a per tonne of product basis. And you can see things like sheep production is generally a little bit more efficient than beef cattle systems due to reproductive rates and growth rates and those sort of things. You'll also notice the steer trading system here is generally lower, but that doesn't include the Scope 3 emissions that are embedded in those animals. So if you include those, they start to go up as well. And this also, just the two graphs, bars that you see here is, this is Victorian data where they've looked at the average of a benchmarking group and then the top 20% of that benchmarking group. And what this shows is that there's not a lot of difference in these footprints often between those really good producers and the average producers because it's around a productivity basis. Once we move through to looking at this on a per hectare basis, this is the same systems that I had on the previous graph. It starts to average out a little bit on a per hectare basis because it's all about sort of standardising the DSE per unit for those things rather than the productivity. But you do notice that the top producers generally have higher emissions because they're running higher stocking rates per hectare generally. So what can we do about it? Up here, there's a long list of things you can do, but what I've tried to break this down into is to a few groups of things that might be of interest to you. So the first one is around supplements. The two main ones that are probably going to come through is one called 3-Knob or Bovaer. It's a synthetic supplement to reduce methane emissions, which is already available. It's highly efficient, and I'll show you a little bit of data on that soon. And Asparagopsis, which is your red seaweed, which has been under development and has had a lot of promotion, but really is probably a lot slower to come through, A, because it's really expensive to produce, and B, there's a few animal health issues that need to potentially be managed with that. So it's probably going to be a lot longer before that comes through the system. The other ones that we can do now is herd efficiency, and this is a big one. So you might be able to knock 10% of your emissions off by just doing things a little bit better at the moment. Getting rid of your cull animals earlier, getting rid of dry animals at scanning, working on your reproductive rate to lift that a little bit. Often when we've looked at this and modelled this out, we've got about 10% of emissions that we can pick up by just doing those things, and that adds to your bottom line, so that improves your business as well. One that we're really focused on is anti-methanogenic pastures or low methane pastures. So that's, we know the secondary compounds in some of our forages that actually reduce methane. And so we're working on trying to put together a package to account for that and the system that needs to be used around that so that that can then be accounted in your business. And then you've also got the sequestration options, the soil carbon and revegetation. When we're looking at what strategies, we should always focus on your emissions avoidance first, and the reason for that is it's lower risk for you in your business. Once you've avoided an emission, you never have to worry about it again. If you sequester carbon to offset an emission, you are signing up nominally that that's going to be a permanent reduction. So you have to make sure that that carbon is permanently stored. And when you look at schemes like the ERF, they discount that for 25 years or minimum 100 years, maximum 100 years. But still, the concept is that it's permanently putting that carbon away. There's risk of that going forward because we're going to have climate change that is going to make our environment basically harsher to manage and to achieve those things. So sequestration should really be only used at the moment as a short-term thing to soak up emissions that you can't take care of through other means. So what are one of the main factors that is affecting our methane production is the dry matter intake of our animals. So if you look at the graph here on the right, that's a graph of the dry matter intake versus the amount of methane produced, and it's a very tight relationship. So about 20.7 grams of methane for every kilogram of dry matter intake that our animals eat. And so really what we're trying to do is find strategies to reduce this down this way. So it's a relationship that we can't break. but what we're trying to do is lower the slope of that line, or so that we've got less methane being emitted with that dry matter intake, because dry matter intake is production in your systems. So there's a few things that we can work on. One is quality, also grain feeding. The propionate in grain actually will reduce some of that. Rumen pH is also a factor, with lower pH producing less methane. And then the one that we're is been most examined is these plant secondary compounds, are things like tannins, saponins, nitrates, fats and oils. And historically, these have been considered anti-nutritional factors, so they've been studied for the opposite reason, because we want to understand them so we can remove them and stop the potential productivity. But in the right doses and in delivered in the right way, they can actually have positive benefits to production, or at least not reduce production, and have reductions in methane. And one thing to keep in mind is methane loss is also energy loss out of your system. And so you don't always pick up a production gain, but you might reduce your dry matter intake to get that same level of production. Back to the feed additives. So there was a student who did a meta-analysis of this. So this is where they looked at all the studies that are out there on supplements, and then pull them into one analysis to look at what is the average effect of a different supplement. So the key one that came out is macroalgae, which is Asparagopsis, or red seaweed. On average, that was about a 45% reduction across all the studies that have been done on this. The 3-NOP that I mentioned before is about a 30% reduction. But I guess with these studies, we've learned a lot more about how to implement them more efficiently as well. And recent studies out of UNE have got where they've used 3-NOP and oils have got reductions of around 90% when fed well. So there's ways that we can do this more efficiently, and we're learning how to do this more efficiently. So supplements will definitely be part of the future, but mainly where we're feeding animals consistently, so in our feedlot systems or fully fed systems with mixed rations. As I mentioned, low methane pastures. We conducted this review it was published last year, where we looked at all the data that was out there on methane reduction from pasture species, and the aim of this was to prioritise what species we would start to work on. So one of the key ones, which is sort of highly relevant to this area, is Bicerula. So when we look at the in vitro, so when we look at methane reduction in the lab, that had an average about a 77% reduction in the lab. Lotus, which is birdsfoot's trefoil, was another good one, but doesn't persist very well, so it's not one that we're sort of looking at in the future. Sulla was also good. Plantain. Chicory was the next one on that list, which was very close to plantain. So the herbs have clearly got a role here, as do a few of our select legumes in developing pasture mixes. And when we look at this, we sort of are looking at the process that we've got on the left here, where we need to not only understand that methane reduction potential, but we need to put this together in a system. So we need to understand the agronomic suitability, so that it's going to be persistent and productive, because if we don't have that same level of production, then our emissions intensity might not be any better from these. And we've actually demonstrated this with Bicerula from some of our, when it's grazed on its own, it actually doesn't improve the methane intensity compared to lucent. So what we're looking at is ways to put this together in a system where we've got the productivity maintained, but we also get that methane reduction potential. We need to follow through the animal production as part of that. And then we need to do the whole integrated systems analysis, which means we need to make sure that we're not losing carbon in other sources, or like we're not getting additional nitrous oxide emissions or those sorts of things. And once we've done all that, we can start putting this together in metrics for carbon accounting, where we can say to you, here's an equation, if you do this, this and this, you'll be credited with this much reduction. And so that's actually a pretty complex process to go through to get to that level. So just a summary of these options. What do we do now? We do the things that benefit your business. Generally speaking, there's no carbon price that's impacting you for your livestock business. So there's no differential out there for you to go and do something different and that to be paid for a carbon price. So the markets out there are actually not rewarding low emissions, except in a few very niche things like the Coles carbon neutral brand. But generally speaking, in the bulk market, there's no differential. So the things that you can do is optimising your supplementary feeding, optimise your animal health, optimise your fertility. That's stuff now that will benefit your business anyway and have a positive impact on your carbon footprint. The things that are coming are things like 3-noppers I've already mentioned, oils and tannins. They're a little bit easier to deliver supplements for something like extensive grazing, so they might be able to be used a bit more. Legumes, just adding legumes, particularly in Northern Australia, is going to be a big one. And breeding. So breeding, there's working on EBVs for sheep and cattle at the moment. And we know with breeding and genetic gain, it's about 1% gain per year. So if you think about 10 years' time of implementing those in a flock, you'd have potentially a 10% reduction in your methane level. So it's something that's small gains annually, but adds up over time and hopefully will start to address the issues that we've got there. In the 10 years, we've got other things that are coming. The plant secondary compounds is part of that. Things like vaccines may be part of that. Asparagopsis, I think, is out over 10 years, even though you're hearing about it still quite regularly. And one that we're looking at is something called early life programming. So this is where you feed, say, a weaned calf in a 3-nop supplement for, say, a 30 or 40-day period, and then that imprints a lower emission for the life of that animal. So it's something that uses that supplement a lot more efficiently, and something that's been demonstrated in a few studies, but needs a lot more to have the ability to predict and have confidence that it's actually going to occur. I just briefly want to touch on soil carbon as an offset method. So, and I'm just going to pick up on a few key points around this. One of the key ones here is that all soil has a limited capacity to store soil carbon. And so if you're implementing a land management change to improve soil carbon, you initially might have a reasonably rapid response to that, but over time, with that same management, that response will decline because you're reaching a new equilibrium in the soil. So you have to maintain that same level of, say, biomass or plant input into the soil to get the same, to maintain the same level of soil carbon. And this is some data from the Rothamsted long-term experiment, but just demonstrates this process over hundreds of over sort of decades. And eventually, this is with barnyard manure. The light blue is where it's been put on at the same rate and eventually reaches that new equilibrium. The curve in the middle is the one where they initially put on that barnyard manure and then stopped and watched it decline back down to the baseline eventually. And the bottom is where there's been no change. And so the key thing about this is if you implement a land management change to store carbon, you have to keep that land management into the future at the same productivity, or if you stop, things that have the potential to go backwards. The other problem we've got in Australia is we've got really quite a harsh climate and quite a variable climate, so it's really difficult to have that consistent year-on-year productivity. So this is some data from a long-term experiment at Condo, where we actually had carbon build up in cropping and pasture systems for a 12-year period. And at the end of that 12-year period, the perennial pasture was higher than the other cropping systems. But over the next 3-year period, we lost all of that carbon that was gained over that first 12-year period. And we did still have the benefit from perennial pasture over the cropping systems, but we've ridden this change that's due to environment. And so if you're looking at the current ERF method and most methods, they're measuring soil carbon over change. And so you've got this potential larger variability than the smaller variability that's going to be picked up due to land management. And so you do have the potential to be credited for periods of time, but then you may lose that. And currently, say if we're in an ERF project after 25 years and you had a deficit over what you'd been paid through that project at the end of that project, there is potential in the legislation for that to be claimed back. Whether the government would actually do that, we don't know. So it's not as straightforward as just measuring between two time points and having confidence that you've built carbon. There's a lot more to it than that. So what do we have confidence that actually builds carbon? One is the conversion from crop to pasture. There's a lot of data out there that proves that works. Additional nutrients in your system, particularly in your pasture systems. Superphosphate has been shown to build carbon pretty consistently across lots of different trials. Grazing management's a really interesting one. We've recently reviewed this again. Sarah McDonald led this, who's one of the staff that works with me. And of all the studies that have been done across Australia, there was actually no benefit from grazing management. It's not that grazing management doesn't have a benefit, it's just that the other variability swamps that when you're trying to pick it up. So the benefit from grazing management is relatively small. So just in summary, what can you do? The first thing to do is know your number. Know your emissions before making any decisions about carbon. So if you're thinking about selling carbon credits to someone else, first of all, understand what your emissions are so that you know what you might be liable for in the future. And then that will help you to understand whether the opportunity for making some money off farm by selling that carbon to someone else is real for you, or whether you might be better off keeping that carbon in your business to offset your emissions in the future. I think plan for the opportunities that will arise through your supply chain reporting. This is something that's going to open up more and more, and more you'll be there'll be people looking to get your number about what is your emissions intensity. That can be calculated through many tools that are relatively easy to use. The things that you do now, livestock efficiency, because it will benefit your business, and you don't need a carbon price to actually make that work for you and reduce your emissions. And then prioritise avoidance over sequestration. And just finally, if you're looking at how that might work in the future, what you might start to do is calculate your farm footprint on an annual basis, because it's just using a lot of the same information you do out of your farm management software. You might be supplying that to your bank, you might be supplying it to some of your supply chain for market access, which means that you might have access to higher value markets that you wouldn't otherwise have. But then it's also an analysis of what you can then do in your business, and hopefully this would be an annual cycle where you can implement some changes and try and get a trajectory to get that down over the longer term. So that's it, thank you.
Very good, thanks Warwick. We're going to have afternoon tea now, and then we'll have a quick Q&A session after that.